Welcome to the Perfect Place to Put a Practice podcast by Scott McDonald and DrDemographics.com, the best source of demographic, psychographic, and marketing information for professionals.
Hello, I'm Scott McDonald, and welcome to the Perfect Place to Put a Practice podcast by DrDemographics.com. Now, in this session, we're going to be dealing with the concept of practicing in an area that has a great deal of poverty. It's been over a year since I've dealt with this topic, but it needs a little updating as, well, new facts and figures have arisen. It is true that there are some dentists who believe that serving the rich is the best option. But the rich are not served in the same way as everyone else, at least not to be effective, and the same is true of structuring a practice to serve the poor. Neither income group is going to be a slam dunk. The practice structure must be adopted or adjusted to serve either or both groups. Now, one common question I get is, Scott, how many Medicare patients are there in a particular area? How many providers accept public assistance dental insurance? Now, let me put this away as an issue. Knowing the number of dentists who accept programs for poverty is not going to help you really much at all. They're often going to limit the number of patients in their programs by lots of reasons. You see, one of them is almost a guaranteed loss, so you don't want too many. And for another reason, these patients and practices often scare off other patients. Now, I'm sure you get the picture. So, like other insurance questions, it's not a matter of how many providers accept the plans. The real fact to keep in mind is how much they're providing that care. The rate of utilization is not shared because, frankly, it's proprietary, and that is very hard to know. Can you make a living serving the poor? Yeah, but the practice must be managed accordingly. Now, I once had a client who proudly said that they served every patient exactly the same, regardless of how much they paid or whether their lifestyle conditions might be different. Noble thought, dumb practice. I present this topic because of certain truths that are intruding upon perceptions. Among them are these. There is a growing population of low-income households in America. While the rich are getting richer, there are many more households that are getting poorer. When we examine incomes, it is typical to divide the population into quintiles. The bottom two quintiles are considered the poor. Now, you would be wise to consider them coming from different demographic sectors. They're just not the same. And number two, those with low incomes are not a monolithic demographic body. They become poor for many different reasons. They stay poor for different reasons. And ultimately, they may become poor for their entire lives. Others are poor for relatively short periods of time. Rather than focus on their incomes, the important factor is their behavior as well as their motivations for seeking care. 3, people of all income categories need treatment. Those who can least afford treatment are often in greatest need clinically. Now, ironically, they're also among the population that is least likely to seek care for many reasons. For so many years working with doctors, I know from experience that they would love to help everyone that they possibly can, but they also have to make a living in the process. I never forget that fact, and neither should you. 4, it is hard to get good data on solid analysis on working with lower income households without being sucked into a vortex caused by, well, compassion fascists and hustlers. By some definitions, 40% of Americans among the poor have food uncertainty, and this is highly inflated. 5, when it comes to race and other issues of poverty, they've been conflated, and this hurts everyone touched by the process. Race is not the same thing as poverty. As much as I can, I'll avoid getting into trying to diagnose poverty's causes, wage disparity, social commentary, and stick to the facts. The largest number of poor households in America are white. They're also the largest consumers of public assistance health plans, food stamps, and housing subsidies. Anyone can be poor, and most people who are presently poor, now this is based upon statistical analysis, get out of poverty at some time in their lives. This is an important point for doctors to consider. So, does it make sense to set up an office that is found in high poverty areas? Yeah, it certainly can, but there are a few caveats worth repeating. Number one, the poor in America usually consume health care with the expectation that someone else is going to pay for it. That is not a universal truth, but it has proven itself to be a likely fact. Therefore, an office that serves the poor must be structured to guide them through the process of government services. In a way, it's as necessary as learning to diagnose and treat clinical needs. Much of the efforts of a practice serving the poor is devoted to understanding and changing government regulations. It is a key to their financial survival. Now keep in mind that most healthcare fraud in the United States is found in offices that serve the poor. It makes sense to pay more attention to the providers of services to the poor than those that serve other income groups. You should count on more scrutiny if you're going to be working with the poor. Therefore, good administrative skills by doctors and staff are more important rather than less important. And all this means that to serve the poor, particularly those dependent upon public assistance, practice owners must be good business people. Number two, there is a correlation between poverty and less education. Now, while very politically incorrect, there is a relationship in the bell curve between low IQ and poverty. And that does not mean that those without high intelligence or education are less deserving of care. They just need more help in navigating the process. Therefore, by understanding this, at the outset, the practice model can be formed that will reflect the realities of the marketplace serving the poor. 3. Utilization of preventive care will always be lower in a poor area. Emergency care is more the norm because treatment tends to be the response to pain, discomfort, or alarming symptoms. In short, patients wait for treatment until they have no other option. For this reason, the cost of treatment will tend to be much higher among the poor than among higher socioeconomic groups. And I think you know this. As a companion to this, the consideration of long-term treatment plans that might involve out-of-pocket expenses are going to be rejected. Therefore, it is wise to provide all the care possible once they're in your office. Recall failure rates will be far higher than in typical offices. For, given the three conditions above, in order to find a location that will serve as an office that serves the poor, it is necessary to have a much larger than average ratio of population to doctors. Now, while a typical practice will require only one provider per, 2,000 to 4,000 residents, in a poor area the ratio may have to be 3 or 4 times that number. Therefore, one must be respectfully and especially careful to determine the number and ratio of providers as sites are being considered at the beginning of the search process. Now, it's interesting to note that because government bodies like states, counties, and cities are often the funder of these services, they likely have their own calculations to determine if there is, in fact, room for one more. And because the poor tend to depend upon public transportation, access to bus and train stations take on an increased importance in practice placement. But one should also assume that these transportation hubs will be the places with the most competition. 5. It is vital to understand that there is a big difference between cultural poverty and circumstantial poverty. These households may look the same to a degree, but they don't act the same way. Now let me explain further. Understanding how the poor behave is what we're discussing. The fastest path to poverty in America is divorce. When a man or a woman separates from a spouse, both risk falling into poverty. When there are children involved, this accelerates the process. It is also worth noting that this tends to be a temporary situation. Now, sure, it may take years, but these people tend to recover in time, as do their children. The same is true of a loss of a job. It certainly causes a crisis in these households, but you see, Americans are relatively resilient. They may have to move to a new city to find work or change their careers entirely. But the evidence is clear. This kind of poverty is not permanent. Now, while illness and death in a family are major long-lasting circumstances, those who suffer from it tend to recover as well. These are what we should consider circumstantial poverty. It's upon this group that practices can build a patient or a client base if they're judicious in what they charge and the services they render. Other types of poverty are not so easy to leave. They're considered the elements of cultural poverty and include drug and alcohol addiction as well as criminal lifestyles. There is no long-lasting program, either governmental or private, that can force someone into recovery successfully. This is also true of mental illness. Addiction invariably leads to criminal behaviors, and that makes treatment and care of any kind impossible. A practice that is founded upon a cycle of cultural poverty will find itself either the victim or co-conspirator in these lifestyles. Now, I've seen doctors and staff fall into insurance fraud, substance abuse, and other marginal legal behavior, all for the very best of reasons. The solution, therefore, is to make a distinction between what type of poverty one is serving and to focus the practice on circumstantial poverty primarily. My company does research in every state, county, and city in the United States and has been doing so for more than 30 years. Personally, I've worked as a volunteer in poverty programs for adults and children, for a very long time in the United States and even in Central America. My family has suffered with close relatives who are drug and alcohol abusers. I've seen poverty close up. Now, all of this has demonstrated that the sociological and demographic studies reflect the realities of life on the street. Can practices serve the poor successfully as well as profitably? I believe they can, but to do so, it should be acknowledged that assertive care, record keeping that is great, good security, and even tough love may be necessary to accomplish this mission. This is Scott McDonald. Catch up with us at drdemographics.com, and thanks so much for watching.